The cold Lithuanian wind crawled across the treetops like a silent warning, carrying with it the metallic taste of incoming conflict. It was late autumn, 1985, an era when the Cold War felt frozen on the surface, yet boiling beneath every military decision, every radar pulse, every night patrol. On the southeastern edge of the Warsaw Pact's frontier, the Soviet 41st Motor Rifle Regiment had dug in along a ridge overlooking a shallow valley, expecting routine field maneuvers, nothing more. No one in the regiment, officers, artillery observers, or hardened machine gunners, had any idea that within hours their perfectly arranged defensive line would be turned into smoking craters, shredded bunkers, and panicked survivors running through fire and dust as if chased by ghosts. Because on that day, they would experience something they had never trained for, never imagined, and never believed NATO capable of. Precision artillery. The Soviets prided themselves on massed firepower. Their doctrine revolved around volume. If you cannot destroy it, drown it in shells. But the idea of artillery that could pick off single bunkers, wipe out command vehicles, and land with uncanny accuracy wasn't part of their calculations. Their textbooks insisted NATO was strong in technology but slow in deployment. Their manuals claimed American artillery was good, but not supernatural. Their officers repeated the same belief: quantity always beats quality. That belief would die before sunset. Early morning, routine becomes ominous. The day began like any other. Soviet troops cleaned their AK-74 rifles, radio operators calibrated their sets, and the gunners of the 122mm D-30 howitzers joked over cigarettes while adjusting firing tables. No one noticed the quiet electronic hum drifting across the valley, the subtle presence of NATO reconnaissance drones, small, stealthy, nearly invisible, mapping every trench, every bunker, every supply crate, and every armored vehicle. But the battalion's political officer noticed something else: the unusual silence. Birds avoided the valley. The usual crackle of distant training drills was absent. Even the wind felt as if it were holding its breath. At 0930 hours, Captain Larionov received a confusing radio message from Regimental HQ. Enemy reconnaissance activity detected. Maintain readiness. Nothing else. No details. No urgency. Just a vague warning, thrown into the calm like a pebble. Larionov shrugged it off. NATO reconnaissance flights were common. The Americans always monitored border exercises. Usually nothing happened. But 20 minutes later, the first sign of impending disaster appeared, something subtle, yet alarming. The earth vibrated. Not from artillery fire. Not from vehicles. But from something far away, something timed, something methodical. Almost like distant footsteps coming closer. Soviet soldiers paused mid-conversation, staring at the ground. Some believed it was an earthquake. Others thought it was NATO tanks far beyond the hills. But no tanks moved, and no artillery roared. The tremors came from something else entirely: signals, adjustments, calculations from NATO guns preparing to strike with machines more advanced than anything the Warsaw Pact had ever faced. The first strike, precision unleashed. At exactly 10:02 a.m., a blinding flash erupted on the northern ridge. Not a barrage. Not a salvo. Just a single, isolated explosion, perfectly centered on the Soviet communications bunker. The bunker didn't just explode. It disintegrated. Concrete shattered into dust. Metal fragments hurled skyward as if pulled by invisible hands. The radio mast flew into the air like a snapped twig. Every Soviet soldier within half a kilometer froze. They had never seen a one-shot kill on a hardened structure. Soviet artillery couldn't hit a bunker unless they fired dozens, sometimes hundreds, of rounds. But this? One round. One target. One instant kill. Before they could process what happened, a second round slammed into the forward machine gun nest on the left flank. Again, perfect hit. No error, no drift, no warning whistle in the air. Just impact and obliteration. Panic began to crawl into the trenches like smoke. "Comrade Lieutenant! How are they hitting so accurately? There must be a spotter close by. This is impossible. No artillery can hit like this. But every Soviet observer scanning with binoculars saw nothing. No NATO teams. No forward spotters. No helicopters. No tanks. Only silence. Silence and perfectly aimed destruction. The artillery net tightens. At 10:05, 3 minutes into the bombardment, the Soviet line realized something far worse was happening. The strikes weren't random. They weren't even focused on the strongest defenses. They were systematic. The artillery was erasing the regiment's nerve centers. First the communications bunker. Then the machine gun nest. Then the anti-tank missile team. Then the command tent. Then the ammunition stockpile. Each hit was so precise it felt like NATO had the ability to see through camouflage nets, through earth, even through steel. Soviet officers shouted for troops to disperse, to take cover, to hide in the forest, but every movement seemed anticipated. Men sprinted between trenches, and the artillery followed them. Groups clustered near supply crates, and a single shell targeted them exactly. A jeep raced down a trench road, and an airburst detonated 20 meters ahead, showering it with shrapnel. The Soviets finally understood. This wasn't suppression fire. This was surgical annihilation. NATO wasn't trying to scare them. NATO wasn't trying to weaken them. NATO was demonstrating a capability the USSR had refused to believe existed. GPS-guided, laser-guided, precision artillery. The kind that turned trenches into graves. The kind that made entire companies disappear. The kind that removed the need for guesswork, spotters, or massed fire. It was a weapon that fought like a sniper, but hit like a tank battalion. Panic sets in. By 10:10, the regiment had fallen into chaos. Some soldiers threw themselves into shell holes, trembling. Others tried to dig deeper into muddy trenches. A few ran toward the forest only to witness trees explode around them with terrifying accuracy. Officers screamed into broken radios, begging for instructions, but no orders came. HQ had gone silent, destroyed in the first strike. The Soviets had trained for many threats. NATO tanks, NATO airstrikes, NATO paratroopers. But not this. Not invisible fire. Not death from nowhere. One terrified conscript muttered what many were thinking. Nothing can stop this. They can see everything we do. His sergeant grabbed him by the collar and pulled him down, but even he couldn't hide the fear in his eyes. Because at that moment, every Soviet soldier knew the truth. Their positions weren't being bombarded. They were being erased, one coordinate at a time. Smoke rolled across the valley like a living creature, thick, twisting, and glowing under the flashes of incoming strikes. What was once the tightly organized defensive line of the 41st Motor Rifle Regiment had degenerated into a maze of shattered bunkers, overturned vehicles, and trenches filled with panicked men unable to comprehend the force destroying them. It was now 10:14 a.m., just 12 minutes after the first precision strike. In that short span, dozens of Soviet positions had vanished with unnatural accuracy. Officers who had once barked orders with iron confidence now shouted in desperation, their voices cracking beneath the weight of the impossible. NATO's artillery did not sound like normal fire. There was no rolling thunder, no chaotic barrage, no long bursts. Instead, one shot. One detonation. One more piece of the Soviet line gone. The rhythm was mechanical, almost surgical. It felt less like a battle and more like being hunted by a machine. The moment fear replaced discipline. Captain Larionov crawled out from a collapsed trench wall, his uniform torn, his radio destroyed, dust covering his face. He was alive only because he had dived into the mud seconds before a guided round landed precisely on his previous position. The explosion had lifted him like a rag doll. Around him, soldiers stumbled, cried, prayed, or froze entirely. Several huddled behind a half-buried BMP infantry vehicle, hoping its armor would provide cover. It wouldn't. Larionov grabbed the nearest trooper, a young conscript with shaking hands. "Get up! Move! We cannot stay here!" "But sir, it's like they're watching us. How do they hit every..." "Move! But even the captain's voice could not hide his own terror. This was no normal artillery. This was something beyond doctrine, something akin to a godlike view from above. Larionov didn't know that miles away, NATO surveillance aircraft and drones were feeding real-time coordinates to batteries of precision-guided artillery systems. Every movement, every vehicle, every regrouping attempt was being tracked by technology so advanced the Soviet manuals still labeled it theoretical. The Americans called it deep precision fires. The Soviets would remember it as the day technology defeated courage. The forest turns into a trap. At 10:17, a platoon of nearly 30 Soviet troops sprinted toward the tree line, believing the forest offered protection. The tall pines stood like dark pillars, a familiar refuge during exercises. But the NATO drones had already mapped the tree clusters before dawn. As the first soldiers crossed into the shadows, the artillery shifted. Not to suppress the forest. Not to bombard it. But to hit specific entry points the drones had marked minutes earlier. A shell landed directly on the narrow dirt path between the first two trees. Boom! A plume of smoke, splinters, and soil blasted upward in a perfect cone. Then another hit a single tree where a machine gunner had taken cover. The tree shattered, not fell, but disintegrated from the force. The men behind him saw the trunk explode into wooden shrapnel and screamed, diving back into the open where they were instantly more vulnerable. One conscript cried out, "They know where we're going before we do!" Another shouted, "This is not artillery, this is impossible!" But impossible things were happening everywhere. Coordination crumbles. The regiment's deputy commander, Major Stepanov, attempted to re-establish communications using backup field radios. But each time a radio antenna lifted above the trenches, even for a second, a guided round struck nearby, severing the connection, destroying the operator, or blowing the antenna to scrap. The Soviets had never encountered counter-battery technology so fast, so precise, so merciless. Stepanov wiped the sweat and dust from his face and whispered, "Mother of God, what kind of weapon is this?" He wasn't alone. All along the lines, groups of Soviet troops were muttering the same thing. A rumor spread. "The Americans have satellites guiding the shells. They can see us with lasers. The drones, they're targeting us one by one. Nothing we do matters." For the first time, Soviet soldiers felt what NATO analysts had long predicted. True technological panic. The kind that breaks discipline. The kind that makes trained men forget their training. The kind that shatters the courage of even elite motor rifle troops. Vehicles become death traps. At 10:21, an attempt was made to evacuate wounded soldiers using two BTR-70 armored carriers. The drivers revved their engines, gunning across the uneven ground. They were visible for exactly 8 seconds. 2 precision rounds landed. One directly in front of the lead vehicle, flipping it. The second directly behind the trailing vehicle, blocking the escape route. The Soviets inside screamed as the carriers burned, ammunition cooking off, hatches jammed by the explosion. The infantry nearby watched in horror. Vehicles that once symbolized protection now symbolized the exact opposite, moving targets just waiting to be struck. A sergeant shouted to his squad, "Don't get in the vehicles! Stay on foot! It's the only chance!" But even on foot, they were exposed. Every cluster of soldiers drew fire. Every movement attracted a guided shell. Every attempt at regrouping ended in smoke and screams. The psychological break. At 10:25, Major Stepanov made the most difficult decision of his career, one that would haunt him for decades. He ordered an unofficial retreat. No permission from brigade command. No approval from Moscow. Just survival. He sprinted along the trench line, shouting, "All units! Fall back! Leave equipment if necessary! Move northwest, spread out!" But it was already too late. The regiment was no longer a regiment. It was a scattering of terrified survivors trying to outrun fate. Larionov saw men abandoning their weapons, crawling on their stomachs like wounded animals, some too terrified to even look up at the sky. Others had gone silent, sitting against trench walls with 1,000-yard stares, unable to move or speak. He grabbed one shell-shocked soldier by the chest. "On your feet! The regiment is falling back!" the soldier whispered. "Captain, why aren't they missing? Artillery is supposed to miss." Larionov had no answer. Because the truth was too terrifying. This wasn't artillery as the Soviets understood it. This was algorithmic death, mathematically perfect, emotionless, inevitable. The final blow of the morning. At 10:29, NATO fired a cluster of precision-guided top-attack rounds at the remaining command posts, a small underground shelter reinforced with timber beams and sandbags. The first round struck the ventilation pipe. The second penetrated through the roof beams. The third detonated inside the bunker, killing the final command team in a single flash of white light. When the dust settled, the bunker was gone. Not damaged, gone. Crushed into cinders. Larionov, who was 200 meters away, felt the shockwave punch through the air like the breath of some colossal beast. He realized then that the regiment no longer existed. It had been erased. Annihilated without a single shot fired in return. And the worst part was still coming. Because NATO wasn't done. They weren't just destroying positions. They were preparing to destroy the retreat. The first salvo was enough to terrify the Soviet battalion, but the second wave, that was the one that truly broke them. Major Sidorov had barely regained control of his shaken troops. His headset crackled with confused voices, some reporting phantom enemy movements, others insisting American scouts were behind every tree. Fear had started to infect the chain of command like a virus. But Sidorov still believed he could salvage order. He still believed the Americans were firing blindly. That belief lasted precisely 3 minutes and 40 seconds, the moment the third American fire mission arrived. It began with a sound the Soviets had not heard before, a rising whistle so faint it seemed to come from inside their own skulls. A dozen soldiers froze mid-step. Others dropped their equipment, staring upward at an empty sky. There were no aircraft, no drones, no artillery flashes, nothing to warn them. And then the ground split open beneath their feet. The new rounds didn't scatter dirt or throw bodies into the air like traditional Soviet shells. Instead, they punched into the ground like surgical blades, detonating milliseconds later with terrifying precision. The explosions weren't massive, they were perfectly placed. Each one carved out a soldier-sized crater, always landing where a man was, never where he wasn't. It was impossible. It was inhuman. It was as if the Americans could see them through the earth. In a command trench reinforced with timber and sandbags, Sidorov stood perfectly still as fragments rained down like metal hail. He knew their positions were camouflaged. They had been careful, no radio chatter, no movement in open terrain. Their equipment was hidden under netting. Their vehicles were covered with branches. They had followed Soviet doctrine exactly. And still the shells found them. Across the battalion line, panic erupted in waves. One platoon abandoned its trench entirely, sprinting through a forest ravine only to be met with 5 perfectly spaced impacts, each landing like a coordinate plotted on a map. The platoons simply vanished, smoke, dust, then silence. Another group tried to take refuge inside a reinforced bunker. They believed its concrete walls could withstand a direct hit. They were right. Unfortunately, the Americans never hit the bunker. Instead, the next salvo landed in a crescent-shaped arc around the entrance, trapping the soldiers inside. The air pressure from the detonations collapsed the entryway, sealing them in darkness. Their screams echoed under the rubble for nearly half an hour. Those screams traveled through the defensive line like a cold wind. Every Soviet soldier heard it. None forgot it. For the Americans, this was not chaos. It was orchestrated destruction. Miles away, at a concealed fire control center, U.S. analysts observed the battlefield through a system the Soviets didn't believe existed, an integration of thermal sensors, seismic trackers, radar overlays, and airborne intelligence streamed in real time. When a Soviet soldier so much as shifted his weight, the system logged it. When a vehicle's engine so much as warmed, the system pinpointed it. And when a mortar team attempted to fire back, finally breaking radio silence, America's artillery responded in 9 seconds. 9. A Soviet mortar crew barely had time to load their first round before a single American shell, just one, landed directly inside the firing pit, vaporizing the entire team and leaving nothing but shredded canvas and a cracked tube. The surviving mortarmen dropped their weapons and ran, abandoning doctrine, mission, and pride. They weren't soldiers anymore, just terrified men trying to escape a battlefield that felt alive, watching them, hunting them. Back in the command trench, Sidorov's face had turned pale beneath layers of dirt. His mind raced desperately. Had the Americans hacked their communications? Intercepted their maps? Were satellites directly guiding the shells? None of his theories mattered. Because at that moment, the trench walls trembled again. A new sound echoed across the battlefield, lower, heavier, almost mechanical. Not a whistle. Not an explosion. A rhythmic thump, thump, thump. American multiple-launch rocket systems. But not ordinary rockets. These were cluster precision, submunition-dispersing storms engineered to erase entire grid squares with clinical accuracy. The Soviets had trained to fight massed NATO artillery. They had trained for saturation fire meant to overwhelm, not hunt. But this was something else. The rockets struck in patterns, triangular, rectangular, circular, and no one understood why until the submunitions began detonating. Each cluster was calibrated to sweep exactly where soldiers would instinctively move when under fire: trenches, gullies, tree lines, ridge shadows. It predicted panicked movement and punished it with cold mathematics. Sidorov's radio operators fled to a secondary trench, only to be struck by a submunition that burst overhead like a flash grenade filled with steel needles. 3 men went down instantly. The rest scrambled in blind confusion. All across the battalion area, Soviet troops were shouting contradictory orders. Retreat! Hold your positions! Move to cover! Do not move! None of it mattered. Every option was already mapped into the American firing algorithms. Men who stayed died. Men who moved died. Men who hid died. There was no strategy left, only survival, and even that was slipping away. At last, Sidorov made a decision he had never imagined making in his entire career. He ordered a full withdrawal. Not a tactical reposition. Not a fallback line. A full collapse of the battalion front. It went against every Soviet principle, every lecture at Frunze Academy, every line of Red Army doctrine. But the battalion could no longer function. Communications were shattered. Leadership was fragmented. Morale was broken beyond repair. Sidorov grabbed his map case, his sidearm, and what little remained of his courage. He shouted at his remaining officers. Get them moving! Any direction, just move! But it was too late. The Americans had already shifted to interdiction fire. Every escape path, north, south, east, west, was sealed by timed volleys that detonated several hundred meters apart, forming a perimeter of fire. It wasn't a wall, it was a cage. Through smoke and dust, Soviet soldiers realized the truth. This was not artillery. This was control. This was mathematics, satellites, sensors, and algorithms working together like an invisible machine. And inside that machine, the Soviet battalion was nothing more than a dataset, one being violently deleted. One soldier stared at the horizon with shaking hands and whispered, They know where we are before we move." Another dropped to his knees and cried, "This isn't war, this is execution." Sidorov, trembling for the first time in his career, looked at the sky and muttered, "How do we fight an enemy who sees everything?" No one answered. Because deep inside, every Soviet soldier knew the truth. They weren't fighting Americans. They were fighting the future. And the future had already won.